Hello, and welcome to our podcast episode number 62, When Monsters Attack, a Broken Hero Rises to Save the World. I am Timothy, and I am here with my very good friend Thomas. Tonight we are going to discuss a film called Godzilla Minus One. Godzilla Minus One is a 2023 Japanese monster movie directed by Hideaki Yamazaki. The story follows Keiichi Shikishima, a kamikaze pilot who fails to act during Godzilla's initial rampage in 1945, plagued by survivors' guilt. He becomes involved in various attempts to stop the mutated monster as it wreaks havoc on Japan. The film explores themes of redemption, sacrifice, and the consequences of war. Well, Tom, did you enjoy Godzilla Minus One?
Well, Timothy, I didn't really enjoy it as much as I thought I would. Don't get me wrong, there were some good parts, but overall it was a bit too slow for my taste. I found myself getting bored quite often during the movie. I mean, we have Godzilla running around destroying things and people, yet the pace is so slow that it feels like a documentary at times. And don't get me started on the characters. They were all just, well, they felt like cardboard cutouts to me. There was no depth to any of them, which made it hard for me to care about what happened to them. I suppose the director tried to focus more on the story and the monster rather than the characters, but in my opinion, that's not a good enough excuse. So to answer your question, Timothy, I gave Godzilla Minus One a rating of 5 out of 10 stars. It was okay, but it could have been so much more.
I can see where you're coming from, Thomas. For me, the movie wasn't as boring as you might think. I did find myself engaged in parts, especially during the action scenes with Godzilla. However, I agree that the characters could have used some more development. They were a bit one-dimensional, and it was hard to connect with them. But what about the message of the film? Did you find that compelling? The themes of redemption and sacrifice are quite apparent in Godzilla Minus One. And I think they add an interesting layer to the story.
Yeah, I can see that. It's just not enough for me to overlook the other issues with the movie. I mean, we're talking about a monster destroying cities and people, yet there is so little emotion or tension in this film. It just felt like a missed opportunity to me.
I can see your point of view, Thomas. But at the end of the day, it's still a movie about Godzilla wreaking havoc on Japan, and that's what we enjoy discussing here in our podcast. Right?
Absolutely. And I'm not saying that Godzilla Minus One is a bad film. It just didn't live up to my expectations. Maybe if it was more action-packed or had better character development, I would have enjoyed it more.
Well, that's the beauty of discussing movies like these.
We all have different opinions and experiences. So, Tom, what do you think our viewers will take away from this movie?
That's a good question, Tom. I suppose they might be interested in the themes of redemption and sacrifice that we talked about earlier. Or maybe they will appreciate the visual effects and the action scenes involving Godzilla. It really depends on what they are looking for in a movie.
Oh, true enough. Well, that concludes our initial thoughts on Godzilla Minus One. In the next part of our podcast, we'll dive deeper into the plot and discuss some specific scenes from the movie. Until then, thanks for joining us today, and remember to keep watching films.
Well, Timothy, let's start by discussing some specific scenes from Godzilla Minus One. One scene that stood out to me was when Keiichi Shikishima first encounters Godzilla in the air. It was a well-directed action sequence with great special effects and tension, but at the same time, it felt like it didn't serve much purpose other than showing off what the filmmakers could do.
That's true, Thomas. The scene where Shikishima tries to shoot down Godzilla but freezes up due to his guilt was quite impactful. It showed how haunted he was by the events of World War II and the bombing of Tokyo. However, I couldn't help but feel that the scene could have been more intense if we had seen more of Shikishima's inner struggle while flying against Godzilla.
You make a good point there, Timothy. Another scene I found interesting was when Godzilla sinks the U.S. Redfish and attacks several other ships en route to Japan. It was one of the few moments in the film where we see how powerful and destructive this creature can be. But once again, it didn't feel like enough happened in these scenes to keep me engaged for long.
I agree with you there, Thomas. The action sequences were great, but they could have been even better if the characters had more emotional investment in them. Take Shikishima's final confrontation with Godzilla, for example. It was a thrilling scene to watch, but we didn't really feel his struggle or fear as he flew into the monster's mouth.
Exactly. The film lacked that human element which could have made the action scenes more intense and relatable. Instead of just watching Godzilla destroy things, we needed to care about the characters involved in stopping him. I believe that's what was missing from Godzilla Minus One.
Well said, Tom. So let me ask you this. If you were to change one thing about this film, what would it be?
I would have liked to see more focus on the characters and their emotional arcs. If we had been given a better understanding of Keiichi Shikishima's guilt and Noriko's loss, maybe the movie would have felt more personal and therefore more engaging. It's not just about explosions and destruction. There needs to be a human element that connects with the audience on an emotional level.
I couldn't agree more, Tom. That concludes our discussion on the plot of Godzilla Minus One for now. In the next part, we'll move on to analyzing the performances in this film and discuss if they added anything valuable to the story or not. Until then, remember to keep watching films.
Well, Timothy, now that we've covered the plot and characters of Godzilla Minus One, let's dive into some interesting trivia about the film. Did you know that Hideaki Yamazaki, the director, had a personal connection to the story? He is actually a second-generation kamikaze pilot. His father was part of the Special Attack Corps during World War II, and this influenced his decision to make Godzilla Minus One as a way to honor his father's legacy.
That's quite fascinating, Thomas. I didn't know that about the director. It adds another layer to the movie, doesn't it? The way he portrays Shikishima's guilt and, struggle with his past feels very authentic and personal. I think that's one of the reasons why many people connected with this film, despite its flaws.
Absolutely. It also explains why the themes of redemption and sacrifice are so strongly present in Godzilla Minus One. Hideaki Yamazaki was able to infuse these elements into the story because of his own personal experiences. I'm sure that added a lot to the movie's overall impact on viewers.
Speaking of impact, did you know that this film had a massive influence on Japanese popular culture in recent years? According to some reports, it played a significant role in reviving Japan's global presence through entertainment and media. The success of Godzilla Minus One helped pave the way for other popular franchises like One Piece, Attack on Titan, and even Neon Genesis Evangelion to gain international recognition.
That's incredible, Timothy. It just goes to show how powerful cinema can be in shaping people's perceptions and influencing culture. I think it's safe to say that Godzilla Minus One is more than just a monster movie. It's a cultural phenomenon that will have lasting implications for years to come.
Indeed, Tom. Now, before we wrap up this segment, let me ask you one final question about the trivia related to this film. Do you think any of the actors or actresses in Godzilla Minus One were particularly memorable or stood out for their performances?
Well, I thought Kyohei Tsuji did a great job as Keiichi Shikishima. He conveyed the character's guilt and inner turmoil very well, and made me care about his struggles throughout the movie. I also liked Hiroki Hasegawa as Ryoichi Nogami. He brought a lot of energy and charisma to his role as a news reporter. But overall, I think the film could have used more depth in its characters and performances to truly elevate the storytelling.
I agree with you, Tom. The actors did a good job considering the limitations of their roles. However, I can't help but wonder how different this movie would have been if it had been directed by someone like Akira Kurosawa or Hayao Miyazaki. Their unique storytelling styles and attention to detail might have given Godzilla Minus One more memorable impact on audiences.
That's an interesting thought, Timothy. But let's not forget that Hideaki Yamazaki had his own vision for the film, and he succeeded in creating a movie that resonated with many people. In the end, we can only speculate about what could have been if different directors were involved in the project.
Well said, Tom. That concludes our discussion on some interesting trivia about Godzilla Minus One. In the next part of our podcast, we'll be analyzing the performances in this film and discussing whether they added anything valuable to the story or not. Until then, remember to keep watching films.
Well, Timothy, I'd like us to discuss another aspect of the film that didn't quite work for me, and that is its soundtrack. It just felt like it was missing something essential. The music lacked emotional depth and didn't really enhance the experience when watching Godzilla Minus One. In fact, at times I found myself zoning out during certain scenes because the music seemed so irrelevant to what was happening on screen.
That's an interesting observation, Thomas. The soundtrack is one of those things that can make or break a film for some people, especially when it comes to establishing mood and atmosphere. I agree that the music in Godzilla Minus One could have been more impactful in conveying the emotions and tensions present within each scene.
Exactly. There were moments where I felt the music should have been louder or softer, but instead it remained at a constant volume throughout the movie. This made it difficult to connect with certain characters or situations on an emotional level. For example, during Shikishima's final confrontation with Godzilla, the music didn't reflect his fear and desperation. Instead, it was just this bland background noise that didn't do justice to such a crucial scene in the film.
I see what you mean, Thomas. The soundtrack could have been better if it had more variety and intensity to match the events unfolding on screen. It would have helped create a sense of urgency or tension when needed, which would have made the action scenes even more thrilling to watch.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the theme song for Godzilla Minus One. While it was catchy and memorable, I couldn't help but feel that it didn't fit with the overall tone of the movie. It felt like a pop song from the 1980s rather than something you would expect in a serious monster film set during World War II.
That's an interesting point. The theme song did seem out of place considering the darker themes present in Godzilla Minus One. Maybe if it had been more somber or haunting, it could have better captured the mood of the film and its characters.
Yes, exactly. In conclusion, I believe that the soundtrack in Godzilla Minus One was a weak point for the movie. It didn't contribute much to enhancing our viewing experience, and at times even detracted from it by being irrelevant or uninspired. However, this doesn't mean that the film is completely ruined because of its soundtrack. There are still many other aspects worth discussing, such as its visual effects, action sequences, or characters.
That's true, Tom. We can't judge an entire movie based on one element alone, no matter how significant it might be. So let me ask you this. What would you change about the soundtrack of Godzilla Minus One if given the opportunity?
I would have liked to see more variety in the music and a better balance between loud and soft moments. The soundtrack should have been able to convey the emotions of each scene without being overbearing or forgettable. Additionally, I think they could have used some classical orchestral pieces during the more dramatic moments in order to create a sense of grandeur and scale that is often associated with monster movies.
Those are some great suggestions, Tom. It would have been interesting to see how different the film might have been if it had a more memorable soundtrack. But at the end of the day, we can only speculate about what could have been. For now, let's move on to another topic in our discussion about Godzilla Minus One.
Sounds good, Timothy. Let's continue our analysis of this film by discussing its visual effects and action sequences. I'm sure there are many aspects worth exploring when it comes to these two important elements in any monster movie.
Precisely, Tom. Let's start by discussing the visual effects in Godzilla Minus One. The film received mixed reviews from Japanese critics, but there's no denying that it had some impressive moments visually. The design of Godzilla itself was well received and looked quite terrifying on screen. It managed to capture the essence of the original monster while also feeling fresh and modern at the same time.
I completely agree with you, Timothy. The design team did an excellent job in bringing Godzilla to life. However, one aspect that I found disappointing was the lack of variety in the other monsters, or kaiju, featured in the film. We only saw one other monster besides Godzilla, which made the movie feel a bit repetitive at times. It would have been nice if they had included more diverse creatures to keep things interesting and add depth to the world building.
That's true, Tom. The lack of variety in the kaiju did detract from the overall experience. But let's not forget that Godzilla itself was more than enough to carry the film. It's interesting to note that Hideaki Yamazaki, who directed the movie, also worked as a special effects director for several films, including Neon Genesis Evangelion and Attack on Titan. His experience with these projects definitely shows in Godzilla Minus One's visuals.
I couldn't agree more, Timothy. Now let's talk about the actors who portrayed our main characters in Godzilla Minus One. Kyohei Tsuji played Kei Aichi Shishikishima, a former pilot haunted by his past, and Hiroki Hasegawa as Ryoichi Nogami, a news reporter trying to uncover the truth about Godzilla's existence. Both actors did an admirable job bringing depth and emotion to their roles, despite some of the film's shortcomings.
I thought Kyohei Tsuji was particularly effective as Shikishima. His portrayal of the character's guilt and inner turmoil was very moving at times. However, I felt that Hiroki Hasegawa was a bit underutilized in his role as Ryoichi Nogami. He had some great moments, but they were few and far between compared to Shikishima's story arc. It would have been nice if his character had more screen time, or if there was more focus on their relationship throughout the film.
Precisely. I agree with you completely. Now let's discuss one of my favorite aspects of this film, the performances. The actors did an impressive job bringing emotion, depth, and to their emotional roles, despite some of the film's shortcomings. However, there was one thing that bothered me about the acting in Godzilla Minus One: the lack of English dialogue lines.
That's an interesting point, Thomas. While I didn't have any issues with the English dubbing itself, it did feel a bit jarring at times, given the historical setting of the film. It would have been nice if they had found a way to make the English dialogue feel more authentic and consistent with the rest of the movie. However, this is just a minor quibble in an otherwise engaging film.
Well, said Timothy. Now let's move on to discussing other films or TV series that were influenced by Godzilla Minus One. One such example is the 2016 American movie Kong, Skull Island, directed by Jordan Vogt Roberts. The movie is set during the Vietnam War and features giant monsters, similar to Godzilla Minus One. However, it differs in its tone, as well as its focus on human characters rather than just the monsters themselves.
That's a great example, Tom Kong. Skull Island definitely drew inspiration from Godzilla Minus One, but also added its own unique twist to the story. The movie had a strong ensemble cast and a more comedic approach, which helped lighten up the mood at times. It was interesting to see how they handled the human drama while still maintaining the focus on giant monsters fighting each other.
I completely agree with you, Timothy. Another film that comes to mind is 2019's Godzilla, King of the Monsters, directed by Michael Dougherty. This movie also features giant monsters, but this time around it focuses more on ecological themes and the consequences of human actions on nature. The film even includes a reference to Godzilla Minus One, with one character mentioning that they used the oxygen destroyer technology from that movie for their own purposes.
That's an interesting connection, Tom. It's fascinating how Godzilla Minus One has managed to leave such a lasting impact on pop culture and filmmaking even decades after its release. The themes it explored and the legacy it created have influenced countless other movies, TV shows, and even books.
Exactly, Timothy. And I'm sure there will be more films in the future that draw inspiration from Godzilla Minus One. It has become a classic, not just within the genre of monster movies, but also as an example of powerful storytelling and visual effects. As we continue to explore this wonderful world of cinema, it's exciting to think about what other hidden gems or influences we might uncover along the way.
Indeed, Tom. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll discover a film that manages to capture the same magic and influence that Godzilla Minus One had on pop culture all those years ago. Until then, let's keep watching movies and discussing them here on our podcast.
I think we've covered quite a lot of ground in our discussion today, Timothy. But before we wrap up, I'd like to hear your final thoughts on Godzilla Minus One as a whole. What were some of the things you liked or disliked about this movie?
Well, Tom, I did enjoy watching Godzilla Minus One for its visual effects and action scenes. However, there were certain aspects that could have been improved, such as its soundtrack or lack of character development. Overall, it was an enjoyable experience, but not one that will stay with me forever.
I agree with you, Timothy. The movie had its highs and lows, but ultimately it was a solid addition to the Godzilla franchise. Now let's move on to our outro for today's episode of Tim and Tom's Film Nights. Remember to keep watching films, discussing them with friends, or even strangers like us here on YouTube.
That's right, Tom. We hope you enjoyed listening to our thoughts on Godzilla Minus One, and that it has inspired you to check out the movie yourself. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you did enjoy it. Until next time, keep watching those films.
And remember, folks, we love hearing from you. Leave us a comment with your thoughts on Godzilla Minus One or any other movies that have influenced or inspired you. We'll be sure to read them out in our next episode.
Thank you for joining us today on Tim and Tom's Film Nights. Until the next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night, everyone.